Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Christy Jones. I am a doctoral candidate affiliated with the John Mitchell Jr. program on History, Justice, and Race at the School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution at George Mason University, which, by the way, will be becoming the Jimmy and Rosalind Carter School for Peace, Conflict, and Resolution this Wednesday, July 1st. We want to welcome you to this Mondays in June virtual town hall, which is a series of conversations that we've been having in collaboration with A.C.T.O.R, which is an acronym that stands for A Continuing Talk on Race. A.C.T.O.R is a program of Busboys and Poets and is sponsored by Busboys and Poets, as well as the Maryland Lynching Memorial Project. And this week, we are all thrilled to have with us the incredible scholar and academic, Dr. Peniel Joseph. So just a few ground rules before we get started. We really invite you to reflect on the opening question that you'll see on the slide. And we invite you to reflect on that question in the chat box, which is over to your right-hand side. Please note that this event is webinar style, so your video and your audio will be toggled off. So we're asking that everyone put their questions in the chat and that we'll try to get to as many questions as possible. Please also note that the event is being recorded. So we want to make sure that you're aware of that. So now it's with tremendous pleasure that I get to introduce CEO of Busboys and Poets, Andy Shallal.
Thank you so much. And I want to say a very special thank you to the George Mason University, Jimmy and Rosalind Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution. And of course also to Charles Chavis, Dr. Charles Chavis of the John Mitchell Jr. Program for History, Justice, and Race. And of course, the Maryland Lynching Memorial Project. I want to say a very special thank you to all of you. And to remind you, this is a series, as was mentioned, that has been ongoing for over 15 years. This is not a new series that we just started after this new protest thing that's happening right now. We actually have been doing this for a long time because we always thought that race is a very important, a central conversation. Even though we're a restaurant and a gathering space, we felt race was an important conversation to have. The series, as mentioned, is called Race, A Continuing Talk on Race. And it provides a venue for intimate and oftentimes, as you would imagine, difficult conversations around the issue of race. It's less difficult for us to have that conversation because we've been doing it for a long time. And surprisingly enough, we're getting a lot of requests and people asking us, how do you do this? How do you do this conversation? Well, you do it by being honest and open and actually talking about it. I'm glad this opportunity has come here. And of course, we have Dr. Peniel Joseph, who's a leading public voice on race issues. And he's also a professor of history at the University of Texas in Austin, as well as founding director of the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy there. He is the author of many books, including The Sword and the Shield, about Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr., and Waiting Till the Midnight Hour, a narrative history of Black power in America. And he's been to Busboys a couple of times, so it's great to have you back. Dr. Joseph, welcome.
Hey, thank you, Andy. Thank you so much for having me. I've been to Busboys for even more than twice. It's home, so I'm glad to be back here.
Wonderful. I'm so glad. I'm so glad. How is Austin these days?
Austin is hot. Austin is protesting and wanting social change. So it's part of one of these epicenters. In addition to when we think about COVID, the shelter-in-place sort of orders are back. There was a time where Texas had sort of reopened and was getting a tremendous amount of new cases. So now everybody's back to digging in like it had been in March.
Oh, interesting. Are you keeping Austin weird?
Yeah, we're trying to make Austin anti-racist and Austin a place that where black Austin matters.
That's great, because that's your local business moniker, keep Austin weird.
Yeah, exactly.
That was a thing, you know? Yeah. That's the beauty of Austin. I want to say, I'll pass it on to Dr. Chavis to say a short welcome, and then we'll start with the questions.
Okay. Well, yeah, again, I want to echo Andy's sentiments and thank you, Dr. Peniel, for being here. It's indeed an honor, and I'm thankful that we're able to have this partnership with you, Andy. You know, at the John Mitchell Jr. program, we're centered around narrative change and social transformation. And I always love it when I have a fellow historian to join me. And so I'm really thankful. This means a lot. and not just Dr. Peniel Joseph's recent work around the work of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, but also something that was dear to my heart is his narrative history of the Black Power movement. And so I want to say thank you again, and I'm looking forward to tonight's discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Charles.
So let's dive in, and then we want also the audience to get involved. So if you have any questions, please go ahead and put your questions in the Q&A, and we'll try to get to them. Audrey will try to get to them as soon as possible. So please put those questions there. Also, a reminder, this is being broadcast live on Facebook at Busboys and Poets. So if you could not get in for whatever reason, you know, a friend that's trying to get into this conversation and can't, they can go to the Busboys and Poets Facebook site and be able to watch it there. So let's get down to it. I know there's a lot going on in the world, as is obvious, right? And I heard you speaking or calling this the third Reconstruction period in America. I know that most people don't even know that there was ever a Reconstruction period, right? I mean, people are just discovering Reconstruction. I think it's the least studied period in American history, especially the first Reconstruction period, than any other period, and so much happened then. What are you talking about? Why are you calling this the third Reconstruction opportunity in America?
Yeah, no, Andy, I'm writing about this now too, so I'm super serious. First Reconstruction is 1865 to 1877.
I think you're cutting off here.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
You froze.
Oh, I can hear you.
You can hear me, Dr. Chavis?
Yeah.
Andy, can you hear me now? Okay.
Yeah.
The first Reconstruction is 1865 to 1877. And that is really the literal and figurative reconstruction of American democracy after racial slavery, after Juneteenth. So that's going to be voting rights for Black men, it's birthright citizenship, it's the end of racial slavery, you get Black elected officials, you're supposed to get 40 acres and a mule, and there's supposed to be equal citizenship. That doesn't happen. Instead, you get convict lease system, you get peonage, you get sharecropping, you get racial terror and violence, and you get racial segregation. That period is sometimes called redemption, the 2 decades from 1877 to 1896. And that's where you get everything from lynchings to sundown towns where Black people can't be a part of or they're going to be lynched. You get really the control and containment of Black labor, the super exploitation of Black labor. And then you get finally the 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson decision that says separate but equal is constitutional. We think about the second Reconstruction as the heroic period of the civil rights movement from the 1950s to the 1960s. So basically the Brown decision, the desegregation court decision to, you can either do the Voting Rights Act on August 6, 1965, Andy, or you could say it ends when Dr. King is assassinated. Thursday, April 4th, in Memphis, Tennessee, 6 p.m. Memphis time, 1968, right? The third Reconstruction, I would argue, is really what's been happening now, really from, I think from 08 to 20, the election of Barack Obama, Black Lives Matter, Trumpism, COVID-19, mass unemployment, George Floyd. So when you think about this third Reconstruction, I think on some levels, you have the triumphs and the tragedies. The triumphs for a lot of people were Obama's election, and a lot of Black people too, and white people and everybody in between disingenuously thought, and when I say disingenuous, I don't mean that as a judgment, just they thought that we could achieve our country, what James Baldwin said, achieving our country, we could achieve it from the inside out. You elect this wonderful Black man, Michelle Obama, Princeton, Harvard, this Black family that was impeccable, just brilliant, telegenic, social justice activists who become president and first lady. And we thought we could get the transformation that we've been waiting for through that. You didn't get that. You got birther movement, which inspires the rise of Donald Trump. You got the Tea Party, you got overt racism, you got comparisons of the first lady to gorillas and chimpanzees. You got all this kind of racial segregation and continued oppression. But then what's interesting is that you also got the Black Lives Matter movement, right? And I think BLM is very, very important for those who are activists, who are scholars, because BLM is in the tradition of not just the Black liberation, the Black freedom struggle, but it's an intersectional movement that's really rooted in radical Black feminism. And if you read Black feminism historically, going back from Mariah Stewart, going back Ida B. Wells, going back to who just won a Pulitzer posthumously, Nannie Helen Burroughs. If you read Black feminism, what you find is they were always talking about race, class, gender, sexuality. It's intersectional. It's saying that the way in which our lived experiences in the United States and globally, it's centered on who we are, right? And that's how institutions receive us. So if we're queer, institutions treat us as queer. If we're Black, they treat us as Black. If we're white male, they treat us that way. So it's race, class, gender, sexuality, our mental health status, whether we're cash poor, HIV status. And BLM came out with that, building on the work of Audre Lorde and Lorraine Hansberry and Barbara Smith and the Combahee River Collective, including Black women in DC, where you're at, Andy, right in DC, who were part of these radical Black feminist collectives, late 60s, early 70s, things like the Third World Women's Alliance, Combahee River Collective, all these different things, right? And including when we think about all of the work that you do at Busboys and Poets, Black feminism has done so much for Black women, not just Black women's studies, but for Black studies and race studies in the United States, because Black feminism, you're thinking about Patricia Bell Scott, Gloria Hull, this bridge called My Back. You're thinking about all the women are white, all the men are Blacks, but some of us are brave, Black women's studies. We're thinking about Angela Davis. We're thinking about Toni Cade Bambara, the Black woman from 1970. These are anthologies that transform the world, and we're seeing them into movements. They had always been part of Black power, part of civil rights. They had always been part of, you think about the work of Keisha Blaine and Black women's internationalism in the 1920s and the 1930s, set the world on fire, right? They had always been, but now they're at the forefront. So Opal Tometi, Alicia Garza, Patrice Conn-Cullors, Brittany Packnett, these are Tamika Mallory. These are these leaders who are talking about intersectionality. You think about Sherilyn Ifill and Legal Defense Fund. So when we think about that third Reconstruction, Black Lives Matter, movement for Black lives, in a policy sense, we had leaders, Black, feminist, queer, gay, who come up and say, we need to center the most marginal parts of the Black community, right? And that's how we're going to achieve liberation for all of us, right? And that proved very, very crucial. So that's one step. The other step becomes this resurgence of white supremacy and white nationalism through the election of Donald Trump. But Donald Trump doesn't invent this. He uses cascading anger about the symbolism of Barack Obama and the way in which that symbolism does turn into substantive hope in some ways, right? Because Obama's healthcare bill, people say it's not big enough, but that was the biggest domestic spending since the Great Society in 1965, right? We could say all these things were not enough, but people felt he was changing the country too fast in terms of a right wing that really utilized the Blackness, because racism in this country is based on a caste system, it's based on racial slavery, but its organized precepts are anti-Black racism. That's why everybody in between is trying to be either close or far away from Blackness or close to whiteness as possible, right? And so when we're thinking about the time we're in, you've got Obama, you've got Black Lives Matter, the first iteration, you've got the white supremacy that really becomes normalized. All of us who wondered what would we have done when Frederick Douglass was alive or Ida B. Wells was alive or the 1960s, we've lived it during this last 12 years, right? And so that's another part. And the white supremacy is real because it impacted public policies on criminal justice. It impacted the looting of the American treasury through a tax bill that was racist and classist. It's impacted assaults against trans lives and especially Black trans lives. It's impacted our healthcare, our environmental care. It's impacted so much around us, right? And then the fourth part, and when we think about this reconstruction, is COVID-19, the Black plague, the racial pandemic, which amplified pre-existing vulnerabilities that go back to the 19th century and racial slavery, right? And then you get mass employment with with the most unemployment that we've had since the Great Depression. And then finally, when you think about George Floyd, what is George Floyd? What is Breonna Taylor? What is Sandra Bland? What is Ahmaud Arbery? This is the super exploitation of Black bodies that goes back to racial slavery. Toni Morrison talks to us about it in Beloved, right? Du Bois talks to us about it in Black Reconstruction, the public and psychological wages of whiteness. We have Frederick Douglass talks about it in his magisterial autobiography, his narratives, the slave narratives. Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth. This is the super exploitation of Black bodies that continued. When Michelle Alexander says there's a new Jim Crow and mass incarceration is a caste system, we have to understand that caste system is a racial hierarchy rooted in racial slavery that evolves and doesn't stop. When Ava DuVernay says the 13th, and you read the 13th Amendment, there's no racial slavery except in cases of incarceration, that isn't just a but, that's saying this is how the system's gonna evolve. You're going to be 4 million free women and men and children, and we are gonna incarcerate, criminalize, punish you, and lead you down a road of segregation, impoverishment, and premature death. And so that's who George Floyd represents, but Floyd is going to inspire because Black Lives Matter had set up the terrain for the Women's March. It set up the terrain for DACA and DAPA and pro-immigration, pro-Muslim marches. It set up March for Our Lives and Me Too. It set up this context of wanting human rights and wanting this transformed American democracy and globally, right? And so what we're seeing with Black Lives Matter 2.0, yes, this is Reconstruction. This is Reconstruction. And one of the things that Reconstruction showed both the first and the second time, these over 2,000 American cities have erupted. Most of them have been peaceful protests. Most of the violence has come from who? The cops. It's come from law enforcement. That's where the violence has come. The obsession with looting really moves us away from what is the cause of any kind of looting, and that is economic misery and poverty. And like Robin Kelly has said, before we said defund the police, it's Martin Luther King Jr. Not only did he occupy Washington, he said defund Vietnam. So we say defund the police and prison abolition, and people say these aren't the right words, Andy, but it's never the right words. When Black people talked about abolition of slavery, that's not the right word. When Black women were talking about women's suffrage, because it wasn't just white women talking about women's suffrage, you had all these Black club women and these intellectuals and these organizers talking about Black women's suffrage. They said that's the wrong word. When we talked about civil rights, that was too strong. When we said racial integration and to end desegregation, that was a no-go. So it's never the right word. And what we have to understand is that morally, when you say defund the police, even if you have to add an explanation and you say abolish prisons, you're saying this in the cause of human rights, resisting white supremacy, and really recognizing Black humanity in the way that people like Ella Baker, Fannie Lou Hamer, the people I write about, Martin King, Malcolm X did. So that's why I say it's the third Reconstruction.
Okay, that was a very great sort of tour down, the history of America in many, many ways. I wanted to do just a follow-up. Why do you think white people are out en masse in this one?
Well, I mean, I think it's a cascading series of events. I think that the coronavirus, when you think about history, nothing happens. It's like, all the pieces matter. You think of whether you're talking about the show The Wire in Baltimore, all the pieces matter. So COVID-19, the president we have, Black Lives Matter, March for Our Lives, so many Black women who've been organizing over the last, not just centuries, but certainly the last decades as well. So we're thinking about the work of people like Beth Ritchie. We're thinking about the work of Barbara Ransby. We're thinking about the Black Radical Congress. We're thinking about Beverly Guy Sheftall. We're thinking about so many different scholars and organizers who've been on the ground planting these seeds, including the ones that we're seeing, like Tamika Mallory and Opal Tometi and BLM activists. So that was one. Another becomes really this idea of this pandemic where we see the vulnerabilities. Black people have died disproportionately, been diagnosed disproportionately, left for dead, forced to work in meat packing industries and slaughterhouse industries, for Amazon, for delivery services, They're the they're the public facing workers, yet they're the ones who, small businesses, they were denied at the highest rate. They're getting less access to the checks and the bailouts that are usually going to the rich or going to the white. So when we think about what this pandemic showed that notions of racial progress were largely illusory. What we've seen in terms of racial progress are archipelagos, and the archipelagos, bubbles of racial progress, with Ivy Leagues and people who can vacation in Sag Harbor and Martha's Vineyard. And that's real, and their success is real, but it hasn't trickled down to the rest of us. It doesn't trickle down to 44 million Black people who are largely attending segregated schools, who don't have health care, whose children are dying from asthma and lead poisoning and asbestos poisoning. When we think about Black bodies, historically, we're super exploited, and COVID amplified that exploitation. They talked about, since the pandemic, billionaires have made $500 billion more on Wall Street and through other shenanigans and the bailout. Yet poor people are having, and Black people are having, the most problems paying their rent, paying their mortgage. We're less than 20% able to Zoom in and work like this from home. So we are, like Malcolm X said, catching hell every day. So this idea of American democracy is nothing but hypocrisy is part of this as well.
And I've got that, but why so many white people in particular? Why so many white people are out in the streets?
I think white people are out in the streets for a number of reasons. One, it's a process of mass unemployment. The shelter in place we're easing. You have people who are primed and wanting to protest the worst government in the history of the United States, at least in its modern history, in terms of this current administration. And you had white people who also were organizers and who got it and wanted other people to get it. Some people were genuinely also outraged just by the murder of George Floyd. We had the viral moment of Amy Cooper. So I think it's a lot of different things that cascaded to produce this watershed moment. And then you see the global cities of Berlin and Munich and London and Oxford, but then also even small towns.
Palestine,
Utah, the Middle East, this is all over. So yeah, somebody just said younger whites are less racist. The data doesn't show us that. What we've seen is that even younger whites who are fine with interracial relationships and different things like that, when you dive deep into the data, they are imbibing the white supremacist, anti-Black racist culture that we are as Americans writ large. So it's not true that they're less racist, but you can have some who are trying to become active anti-racist. You know what I mean? And who are more willing to do that. But the idea that somehow they're less racist, I don't believe that that's true.
Dr. Chavis.
Yes, well, thank you so much, Dr. Joseph. I wanted to just discuss a little bit about your point, specifically as it relates to normalizing this white supremacy. And excuse me if I use my hands, it's a habit. But this normalizing white supremacy, you brought up the president specifically in relationship to this normalization of white supremacy. And the first thing I thought about when you discussed the third Reconstruction was Woodrow Wilson, right?
Yeah.
And the space that he provided, and the ways in which he trafficked in racism and implemented and was blatantly white supremacist and racist, just to be clear. And seeing what step that Princeton recently took in getting rid of the Wilson Center, I'm just really want you to kind of discuss more about that whole idea of trafficking in this white supremacy. Specifically, you bring in historical consciousness where you're going back and forth between history, showing those parallels. And I think it's important to understand one thing that I don't know if you mentioned, but the amount of political power we had during Reconstruction, and then also what we witnessed during President Obama's reign as well. And so looking at the ways in which following those two periods, the racial violence and terror begin to emerge in similar and yet different ways.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. I think that the racial violence and terror are all around us, and not just the first two and now this third Reconstruction. Obviously, we've all heard about Tulsa, Well, Tulsa is really just the highest rates of death. And Robin Kelly has a great New York Times article. He talked about the hundreds, a couple of thousand Black folks in Tulsa who were just put in a camp during 1921-22 after whites burned down the entire town and the entire Greenwood section. So there's a carceral story there with Tulsa as well. But we're thinking Atlanta, Chicago, East St. Louis. There's always been racial violence goes hand in hand with white supremacy and this racial caste system. And I think you brought up a good example, Dr. Chavis, about Princeton. Changing the names in these monuments is important, but the biggest thing we need right now is reparations. And Nicole Hannah-Jones has the great piece in the New York Times. You need reparations. Reparations, and I'm reading From Here to Equality, and I know Sandy Darity has been on me because I'm convinced we do need cash reparations to Black families. I would do it in a bigger way than Dr. Darity is talking about. You've got to prove you have one descendant who was enslaved. My people are from Haiti. They suffered from slavery in a different way. They've been here for a long time. And so I think that people who are from the Caribbean, people who are should be included in it. But I do think you need reparations. And that's going to be the game changer for power differentials here. Because even with corporate America saying Black Lives Matter and voluntarily giving up money, you need reparations. You need Black people to have a base of wealth that was stolen from Black people multiple times over. Racial slavery, the aftermath of racial slavery, during the New Deal and New Deal liberalism, the GI Bill, the FHA Housing Authority, books like The Color of Law, Ira Katz Nelson, When Affirmative Action Was White, they show all this. Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor's brilliant Race for Profit shows this as well, which was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. So when we think about, this idea of the condemnation of Blackness, to use Khalil Gibran Muhammad's brilliant book, The Condemnation of Blackness, this is on multiple levels. So we need reparations. You need to divest from symbols of white supremacy, but white supremacy in substance is Princeton and what they use that endowment for. No Black students, no Black faculty. You've got to show and prove, but part of that is us having reparations where we have the wealth, where we can be on corporate boards, nonprofit boards, but we also have to reimagine all of this. We have to reimagine American democracy. And how do we think about a society that doesn't have homelessness, a society that doesn't have this kind of wealth inequality, a society that doesn't have the wrong side of the tracks in different neighborhoods like Washington, D.C. and Austin, where I'm from, a society that's not about gentrifying and throwing Black people out as soon as there's investment, right? So I think that whether you're talking about Obama or you're talking about the 1960s and massive resistance and the Confederate flags, or you're talking about the late 19th century, racial violence is also always attached to thousands of racist policies, but also the fact that Black people don't have economic power, primarily because of the super exploitation. So white economic power is built on the super exploitation of Black people, and this continues. So sometimes I think people in the 60s, Dr. Chavis, they got it wrong when they used to say Black men and women were going to become obsolete because things were automating and stuff. That's all bullshit. Everybody has value in a capitalist economy. It's who accrues the value. Black people's value is a value that is accrued by other people. Whether you're talking about a Black homeless person, whether you're talking about a Black mother not having good maternal outcomes, it's connected to using Black bodies for fear and loathing to get policies that further criminalize us and to win people elections, using Black bodies vis-a-vis both private prisons, but state prisons, using the fear of Black bodies to loot the treasury. So we are constantly being used. Even athletes are not part, all the athletes, whether you're talking about Cam Newton, whether you're talking about all the great Black athletes who are making a bunch of money, LeBron James might be an exception, they are still not connected to the supply chains of power and privilege that their labor is producing, right? In fact, they come a lot of times from Black families that are from humble origins who are systematically linked to supply chains of grief and misery. And after their athletic careers are over, they go back to the supply chain of grief and misery. We've all seen that, even in 2020, right? And so we've got a lot of work to do, and getting rid of the monuments is great, the Confederate monuments, white supremacist monuments. But the bigger thing is Black people having radical political, social, economic, cultural self-determination. So when you think about Black power, it's from Black power to Black Lives Matter, right? Because that was another thing. At the start, I was saying all the things they always told us was wrong. They told us not to say Black power. That was taboo, right? And then when you say Black Lives Matter, they say don't say that again, because this is a virulently anti-Black racist society that has never recognized Black humanity. And that's how come you can snap George Floyd's neck. But what you've done to Breonna Taylor, what you've done to Sandra Bland, that dehumanization is what this is all set up, what it's all based on. And this is a moment where we have to look at everything simultaneously, which is why it's going to take us having laser-like focus, because it's really all of the above on the multiple choice test. You know, Black Lives Matter, Fox News and Keeanga Yamada-Taylor, Professor Yamada-Taylor tweeted this out, where they had what Black Lives Matter wanted, and it was like reparations. It was 10 different things. It was wealth redistribution. It was freeing all sex workers who are in jail. It was a whole list, right? And she said, yeah, we want the whole damn thing. And I completely concur. We want the whole damn thing. And so Princeton, getting rid of your white supremacist master's name does not make you legit in a human rights campus. It doesn't, right? 5 years ago, Black people protested too, and they only got rid of it once all the white people were by our side. So we understand that Princeton and these places that are worshiping at the altar of white supremacy, these are all places and institutions that are morally reprehensible. And I'll say it again, they are morally reprehensible. And it's important for us to understand that, to speak truth to power. And that's why people like, one, they don't want to touch Malcolm X, because Malcolm X was the boldest critic of white supremacy ever, right? And he said that white America, he charged white America with a series of crimes against Black humanity. Dr. King, who they love to say was their big teddy bear, he charged white America with a series of crimes against Black humanity too by 1967, by 1968. So there's nowhere to run. There's nowhere to run. So it's not just Princeton. These organizations in this whole country, like Stokely Carmichael said in 1966, from top to bottom is racist. It's white supremacist. So we have to reimagine, and there's a great book, Eddie Glaude's Begin Again. Baldwin said we had to begin again. Baldwin said the only way we could achieve our country was by facing this reckoning head on. And what's so interesting is that it's this third Reconstruction where we're facing it head on.
Do you think, is it possible to make this change without violence? I mean, I would like to think that it's possible, but I also believe that there's all these young white people out in the streets are almost, how should I say this gently? They're out there, in my opinion, to not necessarily to give up privilege, because privilege is not given up like that. You know, it just doesn't work that way. Nobody goes and offers their privilege and say, take it from me, please. You know, so I have a little bit of a suspicion here, and I hope people don't take this the wrong way, but I feel like a lot of the white folks out there are out there to protect whiteness, in fact, because Trump has given whiteness such a terrible name, and has given white supremacy such a terrible name, that they're willing to wrestle it back. And it's almost like undoing some of the radical efforts that Black Lives Matter is trying to do by kind of mixing in with it and turning it into this, you know, this latte rather than a nice strong coffee. That doesn't have it. That doesn't. So I don't know if you're gathering where I'm going with this.
I think that we need allies. Here's what I think. I think that most of the violence has been from the police. There's also been provocateurs like folks who are saying they're part of Boogaloo. Law enforcement on the DQ has been part of this violence. Of course, there are times folks who are opportunists who aren't related to either left or right spectrums. You know, they might just be looters who actually, people who are trying to survive and actually need these goods and services that they can't get, and these items maybe to sell, maybe to get baby food and baby clothes. So there's that too. I'd say that the violence is going to come, but the violence is coming from the state. The violence is coming from the state. I think that those of us who are protesting and demonstrating should be nonviolent. But I think that what you saw with the white man who's 75 years old in Buffalo who got his head cracked, you saw the state reveal itself to the world. And again, this isn't the first time. I mean, this is just the first time you have this large numbers of white people who are saying that they are disgusted by this grotesque kind of use of violence and racial terror. But in 1968, when protesters were getting brutalized in Grant Park, Chicago, they said, the whole world is watching. That's what they chanted, because they were showing the entire world that the United States of America, the empire, had no clothes and it had no morality. And Dr. King had said the same thing. The reason why he breaks with the Johnson administration is 67. He says, the United States, April 4th, 1967 at Riverside Church, he said, is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. He said it's going to be a bitter but beautiful struggle to try to transform this country, right? So King started to look for the same reckoning that Baldwin and Ella Baker and Fannie Lou Hamer and all these folks along the way have wanted. So I think that the violence is coming from the state. And certainly I think that America's also created a monster, Andy, with the criminal justice system, because you have 800,000 cops, 18,000 police departments. They want their money from the state. That's what's going on there. So that's our money that we're saying, no, let's end that, rethink public safety, abolish prisons, right? And let's pour that money into care and an ethic of care, what Dr. King called a beloved community, Andy, that was free of racism, free of economic injustice, free of violence, free of wanton materialism, right? And they're ready you've got armed white men, at times women, who are ready to go in the streets to defend, it's not liberty, it's not democracy, it's to defend having the privilege to kill and murder and maim and execute Black people. But again, they've created that monster, because this would be easier to pull back if we are at the 1968 numbers, right? So over 52 years, we've gone from 300,000 in prison to 2.3 million in prison. You know, we had less than 1 million people on parole probation to over 4 million people on parole probation. You got 1 million workers in the United States who are connected to the carceral state as employment. What are we gonna do with them, right? When we think about what we do, when we take young Black men and women from Black communities, when they're in prison, Andy, they count in terms of census data for those white neighborhoods. So we actually, not only do we rob them of familial resources and kinship networks, right? We actually incentivize white supremacists to incarcerate Black people like they were trying to catch runaway enslaved Africans. That's what's going on here. That's what's going on here. So this is an absolute moral and political crisis. And like Dr. King said in 1967, the reason this is happening is because of white racism and white supremacy. Dr. King said in 1967 that white people are saying that there'd be racial justice if there were peace in the streets after Detroit, after Newark, but they're the ones producing the chaos. This is King, right? And the Kerner Commission in 68 said the same thing. That was a bestseller, 700,000, New York Times bestseller, early 68. And then people saw what the price tag was gonna be. They closed it. And instead of getting the beloved community, what we got was Law and Order, which was a euphemism for we're gonna lock up every last Black person that we can, right? And so that's Nixon, but that's not just Nixon, it's every single president afterwards. Obama at the federal level tried to bend the curve, especially in the last 2 years. Certainly it's Clinton, certainly it's Reagan, certainly it's all the presidents, because it became bipartisan warfare on Black people. And there were even Black elected officials who were part of this. You read James Forman locking up our own, he won the Pulitzer Prize, what they did in DC. You're locking up our young people for marijuana, for smoking weed, a joint. This is madness. And it's because of the lack of deep empathy for Black lives as human beings. That's what we do. We lack that deep empathy, which is why white girls and boys, men and women get millions of chances, right? No matter what they do, right? The actor Robert Downey, you can be on drugs, you can do all this stuff, and then you're fine. But if it's us, that's it. That's it. You're done. You know, they lock the door and throw away the key. So the violence is coming from the state. I do think we need allies, but we absolutely don't need opportunists.
I just wanted to extend on that a little bit. I mean, I think it's so blatant in this moment that we see, and Black people throughout our experience here in this country, we understand that this violence is coming from the state, right? But I think the awakening that we're witnessing on behalf of whites and also across the world is that these are realities. Like they're just not. That's not something that we only experience, and it's something that I think has opened the eyes of broader Americans, but also those across the globe. I can just give several examples from the recent uprisings. One of the couple ones that reminded me that I highlighted and thought about was the CNN anchor who was arrested on live television, right? And then you have to see the surprise in people's, just how surprised they were. Then there was one that oftentimes people forget about, but there's an incident where there's a white female reporter who was being shot with rubber bullets live, and they're live on TV, and the crew's like, what is going on? Like, what's happening? Why are they shooting you? Like, and it's like, these are the things that the Black community has been trying to tell you about, right? About the state-sanctioned violence, this perpetual violence. And the fact that I think we're at a different moment, and this gets to my question about the moment we're in, you're at a certain moment when they don't care that the cameras are on anymore.
Yeah.
They have a license to do this, not just to Blacks, but also to those whites who even attempt to entertain. And, even as Andy mentioned, try to get back some of that, the privileges he was referencing. So to the moment in the shift that you discussed, you talked about the need for reparations, but do you think we're any closer to that, to reparations, specifically as it relates to the current phase that we're in as it relates to the Black freedom struggle?
No, absolutely. I think we're closer to any of this stuff than we have been before. I mean, on some levels, you're as close as you've ever been, just because you have more people on your side. And also I think the United States is as starkly divided now in 2020 as it was on the eve of the Civil War. So when you think about the Civil War, you had people who were either pro-slavery, the extension of slavery, and that economy, the world that racial slavery made, and people were anti-slavery and willing to fight for it. And by 1863, almost 200,000 Black men then were allowed to fight for anti-slavery as well. And so I think you're very close. I think that Representative John Conyers, the late John Conyers, who had always tried to introduce H.R. 41, study of reparations. I think that with the work that Sandy Darity, the work of NCOBRA, National Coalition of Blacks, for reparations, very, very important, has been carrying this weight and this responsibility for decades. We're thinking about Mary Frances Berry and the brilliant book, My Face is Black, My Face is True, about Callie House. We're thinking about James, when we think about, I'm losing his name right now, who did the James Foreman Sr., who did he demanded $500 million from predominantly white churches in 1969. So we've talked about reparations for quite a long time, and it's really important in terms of, because the wealth gap in the United States is one of the biggest drivers of Black impoverishment. Reparations are only one part of what you're going to need. I mean, reparations, defund the police, a transformed military budget, an end to racial segregation in public schools and neighborhoods. So you do need wealth redistribution. You do need a universal basic income. You do need health care for all. You do need free education. These are all things that are absolutely possible in a world where Black lives matter, and you're not trying to set up a political system based on two things: the super exploitation and control and constraining of Black people, and also the dehumanization and the demonization and the disparagement of Black people from womb to tomb, right? That's how we live right now. So I think you're closer, and that's why all of this is much more in the air. And so from that perspective, it's a very, very exciting time because, again, these things, like you say, defund the police, prison abolition, these things have been around for decades and decades and decades, but they've never been mainstreamed the way they are now. And then Black Lives Matter, BLM, both its first iteration and 2.0 are really what we credit, and they're building on the work of civil rights, Black power, queer, Black feminist, Black lesbian, all this different work that has been done has coalesced into a new freedom movement that is very, 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 very self-aware of the granular changes that need to be done. So again, the monuments are important, but you're going to need to sift down much deeper than that.
Thank you. I want to, me and Andy are doing a lot of the talking. We wanted to, the question.
Oh, yeah.
I want to open it up to the audience. Christy, do you have any questions?
We do. Actually, I'm going to invite Audrey Williams, who obviously you all know and is often a very integral part to these events. And she has a question for Dr. Joseph, and we want to go ahead and give her a chance to ask that.
Great. Thank you, Christy. And Dr. Joseph, thank you for being here. Thanks to Andy and Dr. Chavis, as always, for moderating a fantastic discussion. So I wanted to kind of loop back a little bit to the discussion you have mentioned about kind of symbolic action, particularly around monuments. But I want to bring it out more broadly too, because I think, you know, the monuments obviously are something that we're really focused on right now, but then there's a lot of symbolic action that I see happening as well on social media, right? Especially from people who would like to be allies, but, you know, there's been a lot of discourse around, you know, what is the efficacy of a Black square, for example. And so I wanted to really ask if you could expand a little bit upon, you've talked in the past about how, you know, symbols can have an impact on substance. But I wanted to know if you could expand a little bit, and you mentioned earlier too about, you know, the actual lived experiences and how we need to really address the disparities and the actual impact of anti-Black racism. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the link between symbolic action and actually making sure that symbolic action then does lead to material impact for Black people.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think we can do this a number of different ways. I think that we've seen everything from, you know, the NFL to different Fortune 500 companies, say the BLM square. There's been great articles about certain companies trying to say that they're down with BLM just as riot prevention, they border up their stores' windows and they say Black Lives Matter, right? So no, so much of this is resource driven wherever you're at. So people who are allies have to invest in anti-racism. They have to invest in local racial justice and anti-racism in their own internal culture. And we've seen this on social media. Black people, Black women and men who've worked at certain companies have called them out after they've released Black Lives Matter statements, right? The Poetry Foundation, the theater industry, Hollywood, hundreds and thousands of actors and different people have said, look, the whole industry is racially biased and you know, is racist, is white supremacist. And so that has to change. So what allies can do is, in addition to just, you know, and I see the neighbors doing it too, they've got the Black Lives Matter stuff posted right here in Austin. You've got to bend the curve in your own life. So that means wherever you're at, whether you're in a church, whether it's your children's public schools, whether you're thinking about zoning policies in your neighborhood, the more density you have, if you live in a white suburb, the better off it is for Black people, because you can make certain that they're going to have access to that density, meaning that there can be corridors where, instead of it being informal rental agreements like it is among white suburbs nationally, where what a lot of people don't know is there's a bunch of poor white people who get access to even some of the wealthiest white suburbs through just informal networks. If you're white, There are people who do it for you as a hookup. If you're Black, the apartment for you and your kid is not available. That's just real. That's just facts. So we have to drill down at a very, very personal level. Whatever organization you're in, you should see what is the percentage of Black people in your city, and how come that's not reflected in whatever org you're in, whatever C-suite you're in, whatever nonprofit board and for-profit board you're in, whatever supply chain you work with, and then also local political activism. All white allies should be for defund the police. If your racist friends ask you why, look it up and tell them that, hey, defunding the police is rethinking public safety in a way that means all the thousands and tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of Black people have been killed by the criminal justice system will have access to dignity and citizenship in the same way you want your white children to, right? And so there's so much that allies can do in terms of policy-wise, defund the police. We have to talk about racial integration. Allies should be supportive of reparations. They should be supportive of decarcerating, and we should be letting people out of prison right now. We have hundreds of thousands of people in prison we could let out immediately who are on there for minor crimes, minor offenses, who've been racially profiled and arrested. So there's a lot that can happen. But for everybody who's part of a nonprofit, who's part of a church, who's part of any kind of thing that happens locally, civic action, you should be centering anti-racism and racial justice to what you do. You should be doing that. Like, that's an immediate thing. Yes, you should be reading, and of course I'd say read my books too and find out the history, but certainly Ibram Kendi, How to Be an Anti-Racist, that's a terrific book that I teach. Stamped from the Beginning, White Privilege, Thick by Tressie McMillan Cottom. Read as much Black feminism as you can. Patrice Kahn Colors, When They Call You a Terrorist, the Black Lives Memoir. Anything you can by Audre Lorde and Tony Cade and Beth Ritchie and Angela Davis and Beverly Guy Sheftall. So there's a lot of things that allies can and should be doing. And for those allies who are wealthy, they should be investing. They should be investing in Black anti-racists. Certainly there's the big national ones, Color of Change and EJI and LDF, and they're doing amazing work. But in every little town, city, hamlet that you live in, there's somebody doing anti-racist work, racial justice work. And white allies should also be centering this idea of Black equality, Black dignity, Black citizenship over and above diversity, equity, and inclusion. The biggest lie that white supremacists pulled was diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI. It's a hustle, it's a lie. It's a way so that we will not ever achieve Black equality and dignity and citizenship, because you can claim diversity and there's no Black people in the room. How in the hell is it diverse when there's no Black people in the room if you're not in the whitest town in Utah or Vermont? We are everywhere. So you can run that line if you're somewhere out in Montana and parts of Wyoming, but we are everywhere. We are everywhere, when they say we don't die, we multiply, that's where we're everywhere. We're everywhere, right? So stop all that hustling. And really one thing that white people have to train themselves in, and this is a lifelong project, deep empathy that Black people matter. Not just somebody who's a lover, a husband, a son, a child, all Black people, including George Floyd and Sandra Bland and people who look like that. Not people who look like movie stars, people who look like regular, conventional Black people. Most of us don't have green and blue eyes. Most of us don't have so-called good hair. We are Black people. We're from West Africa, most of us, in that slave trade, okay? All of us who are coming out some other thing, that's the context of rape. That's the context of not like consensual relationships. That's why that great essay in the New York Times, My Body is a Confederate Memorial, everyone should read that, because she's talking about being a product of rape and sexual assault that goes sort of a long history. So we need deep empathy alongside of reparations and the policy changes and transformations. And again, going back to what Andy said, yes, there will be violence because white supremacy is violence. It's a regime that's predicated on violence. And we can say white supremacy, racial capitalism, patriarchy, heteronormativity, we can use all of it, but it's premised on using violence to police the boundaries. And that's why if it wasn't so violent, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is the Prince of Peace. You could say, oh, I understand Malcolm X was talking revolution, self-defense. You understand why he died, and he was murdered by the state. But why is Dr. King assassinated? He's assassinated because he's coming to Washington, D.C. to occupy D.C. No guns, no knives, no curse words. But he's saying this must all end. And he's helping 1,100 striking sanitation workers in Memphis, Tennessee, when he's assassinated, because he's saying we're going to have a universal basic income. And they've said they're going to stay in DC forever until Congress passed it, right? And he's assassinated before Resurrection City, right? So this is not a peaceful country. This is not a peaceful country. It's important for us to understand that, because then you can organize and you can face that. This is not a peaceful country. We can say these, Robin Kelly talks about audacious freedom dreams. We can say our audacious freedom dream is for us to be a peaceful country. And we're not doing drone strikes. We can keep safety. We can keep security. And we don't kill every single person who we disagree with and who's in our way.
Wow. Thank you so much, Doc. Christy, I'd hate to have your job, right? How many questions?
The questions that are flowing are amazing, but I do want to get to a question that is coming from one of our regular attendees and a very generous supporter, Joshua Levin. And he has a question, Dr. Joseph, that says, you teach at the LBJ Lyndon Baines Johnson School, where Joshua also got his MPA. Can you speak about the secret radical that lived within LBJ himself? I may be wrong, but I feel like he was particularly non-racist president, particularly for someone of his time and place.
Yeah, I mean, LBJ had his own deep racial blinders. That's well documented in different biographies of LBJ. He used racial slurs in his time, but certainly in the context of the 20th century, he's going to be the most pro-civil rights president during the heroic period of the civil rights movement, right? So you get the Voting Rights Act, you get Civil Rights Act, you get Great Society, Head Start. Two shining moments are 1964, when he announces the war on poverty, and also 1965, March 15th, when he does the joint address to Congress and say, dignity of man, destiny of democracy. He supports Dr. King and the peaceful protesters in Selma who were brutalized by Alabama state law enforcement. So there's a long history of law enforcement killing, murdering, maiming Black women, children, boys, girls, men, women. Very important to remember. So Johnson has a lot of pluses, but when you think about Vietnam and Dr. King saying, let's defund Vietnam, and Johnson, the Cold Warrior, really the money that's supposed to go into the Great Society really goes into the Vietnam War. And Johnson, as Black people become more and more radicalized, you do see the limits of Johnson's racial bonhomie or racial rapprochement. He doesn't like Stokely Carmichael. He doesn't like the Black Panthers. There's going to be a falling out with Dr. King. So he's thinking about the Great Society within limits. And Dr. King is saying there can't be limits because, like King had said at the March on Washington, we come to cash a check that has been stamped insufficient funds, but we refuse to believe that the Bank of American Justice is bankrupt. And so that's what King said, and that's why he's going to have the falling out with LBJ. So LBJ does a lot of good things that we still remember, and that are very, very important and crucial. And we can say we're going to amplify those positive aspects of the legacy. But really what King was trying to get, even in 1968, which was going to be a $100 billion freedom budget, $150 billion over 10 years, even that would have been a drop in the bucket, but it would have been more than we got in terms of the war on poverty in a concentrated time period.
Thank you so much, Doc. Christy, who else?
Yes, the questions are truly rolling in. I'm trying to find another one. This came from a caller who's listening online, and this person was referencing the mass resignation of Atlanta police that happened a few weeks ago. And the caller was asking, is there nuance when police officers resign from their positions of public service when asked to change their behavior, including not shooting and choking Black citizens. How are you feeling about those sort of actions that are taking place? Are you seeing them as resistance to change, or what are some of your thoughts on that?
I think it's an effort by them to resist and protest the change, but I think we need fundamental structural change, and local people are really leading the charge. I think the federal government is way behind. Obviously, Washington is enormously dysfunctional because we have a white supremacist, not just president and administration, but culture and ethos there, in some ways in a bipartisan way. So local people really need to say, what kind of law enforcement do they want? What kind of public safety? Los Angeles spends $1.8 billion on public safety, 54% of the general fund. You know, some people might say, well, maybe 25% of the general fund is a better number, and we're gonna have much less cops with guns. Do we need cops with guns at universities and in public schools? Do we need this surveillance and this criminalization of whole communities? How come the world doesn't look more like the suburbs? Is it just that the suburbs are full with such fine, upstanding white people who don't take opioids, who never smoke joints, who don't do anything? Or is it that we're policing them and we value them in ways that we don't, the so-called ghettos, right? And so I think that, you know, whether it's Atlanta PD doing mass resignations, whether we've heard online Boogaloo and different folks saying they're trying to kill Shaun King and murder people, we're seeing we have a big problem. Martin Luther King Jr. told us in the 1960s we were a sick society. We've grown sicker since, right? We've grown sicker since, not better, sicker. So we've got a big, big thing to unwind. And like I said, you've got 800,000 cops, you got 1 million people connected to the carceral state as employees who get benefits, who get healthcare. They're going to be very, very angry, and we have to actually move forward with this movement courageously, even in the face of all that anger and all that hatred and all that, yes, violence. So that's where the violence is going to come from. The violence is coming from the cops. The violence comes from the state, and the violence comes from whites who, even those who are poor, because of the caste system, because of racial slavery, because of white supremacy, because of anti-Black racism, they receive more benefits than they would accrue if there was no racial caste system, okay? So people have to understand the lily white suburbs are intimately connected to segregated, racially segregated, economically impoverished Black neighborhoods. One doesn't exist without the other. It's not that the white folks are so lucky and they're brilliant and they're good. They're like chess players. They're just better at us at this life thing. No, it's a system. It's a system. It's actually a system. And that's why the system actually predicates your outcomes. Your outcomes are predestined. And that's why when Lyndon Johnson did, and for the person who's talking about Johnson, LBJ's greatest speech is the Howard University speech. They don't follow up on it. June 4th, 1965, where he said we had to have equality of outcomes, not opportunity. Anybody who's talking about equal opportunity, do not listen. Please do not listen. We need equality of outcomes. It doesn't mean everybody's going to get the same test score, but I'm talking about healthcare, decent housing, desegregation, employment, universal basic income, wellness, and an environmentally safe place for your children that includes childcare, elder care, and women should get a year or more of paid leave for each pregnancy, okay? For each pregnant, so, or anybody who's gonna have a baby, really. So when we think about, you know, where we're at, I mean, you know, we're in a very, very specific place where we have to talk about outcomes. We have to talk about reparations. We have to talk about how do you achieve Black dignity and citizenship in a place that is predicated not only on you not achieving these things, but institutionalizing a racial caste system that is organized around you not achieving those things and blaming you and criminalizing you and dehumanizing you for not achieving those things, while super exploiting your labor and your very presence in a way that redistributes your value upwards. Not your soul value or your spiritual value, but your economic value. That's the bind that we're all in. That's the bind that we're all in.
Thank you, Dr. Joseph. I'm going to follow that up with two questions from two different people. I'd like to make sure we get to a question from Dr. Omar Eaton Martinez, who is one of the Diversity and Inclusion Fellows with the Alliance of American Museums, and also works and has worked for a long time in the monuments and museums field, and is doing so right now for PG County, I believe. But his question is, if decolonizing our public memorial practices is the next phase for our country, should we replace the Confederate statues that are taken down with other statues, for example, the MLK Memorial, or just find new ways to commemorate freedom fighters from all intersectional identities?
Yeah, I think I think memorials are good. I think that getting rid of Confederate memorials and statues are the low-hanging fruit. I think there's going to be other questions and debates, and I saw Charles Blow had an excellent essay about George Washington. I think we should celebrate intersectionally and allyship and Native people and Latinx people. Asian, the whole works. But I do think that it's important for us to understand that the country is built on anti-Black racism and racial slavery. So anti-Asian racism, anti-Latinx racism, unless you're talking about folks who really proactively say they're Afro-Latinx and they identify with us as us, are mistaken for us, and happily to do so. It's not the same as anti-Black racism. So, sometimes people will say, well, is there an oppression Olympics, a racial hierarchy? There is a racial caste system. There is a racial caste system. So yes, there actually is, So there is a group of people who the check is long overdue, who's been running the nation credit for centuries, and it's Black women and it's Black men and their kids. And it's important for us to say that. You've got to say it, because when you don't say it, you get caught up. Malcolm X used to say that we've been tricked and we've been bamboozled and led astray and hoodwinked, right? And that's what happens. I say you've been tricked, you've been bamboozled, you've been led astray, you've been run amok, they're telling you one thing, it's a bait and switch. You need to be pushing for Black equality, for Black dignity and Black citizenship. And you can make an argument when you get that, it's going to reverberate to all these other groups. And I like what Black Lives Matter does. It says, we're going to center Black trans lives, Black queer lives, Black poor people, Black folks who are mentally ill, Black women. So, that's very, very hugely important. But we can't just say that everybody has gotten the same treatment, because it's just not true. It's just not true. The organizing principle of the United States of America is white supremacy. It's definitely racial or racist capitalism, and it's anti-Black racism. Hugely important for us to understand that, because that's why Black people are in the boat they're in. That's why when affirmative action was used for white women got a lot more access than Black people did, right? At the C-suite level, politicians, wealth building, right? Because the organizing principle is anti-Black racism. The group of people who are despised and are demonized and are marginalized and dehumanized systemically, institutionally, structurally, in churches, in schools, in playgrounds, in the criminal justice system, in statues, are Black people. This is the only group that this has ever happened to with this depth, breadth, and scale in the history of the Republic, in the history of this democracy. So it's important for us to remember that as we think about these next stages. We got to keep our eye on the ball, and that's really defeating anti-Black racism, defeating white supremacy.
We're going to go to one last question, and then we're going to give some time for wrap up, because this has been such a tremendous conversation. And I'm picking this question because it is one that's near and dear to my heart as an up and coming scholar, as a future, as a doctoral candidate. We have an attendee that asks or says, I work for universities, and I'm curious if you've seen any meaningful moves on the part of university administrators to atone for higher ed's sin. If not, what actions could administrators take that aren't just performative, but impactful? And this attendee would be curious to hear about your experiences as a Black scholar at UT in Austin, or just in academia generally.
Yeah, no, the answer is no. The answer is no. I mean, the actions that they should be taking are a number of different things. I mean, universities are corporations. They hold the public trust. They have endowments. So one, just the culture of the university. I mean, every student should be required to take an anti-racist racial justice course to be able to graduate from any program, undergrad or graduate. Faculty should be trained as well, and so should staff. In terms of their diversity or their racial justice recruitment efforts, I think it's just like basically should reflect the demography. Texas has something like 11 or 12, 15% Black people. Austin only 8%, but at UT we're maybe 3 or 4%. So UT doesn't do a great job.
What would you like to send? You can ask me to send an email or...
Okay, I was gonna say, are we being Zoom bombed? So UT only has 3 or 4%, but we have much more of that, especially Black males, when we think about the football team and the basketball team. So they could do a bunch of things. I mean, one, every university in the country should have an anti-racist center. My friend Ibram Kendi has got a anti-racist center at BU, and I've one of my mentees, I've known him since he was in graduate school, blown up, brilliant, but BU has an anti-racist center. Every school should have one. Every school should have something that's university-wide, that's well-funded, and that connects those of us who are doing racial justice work along outside of silos into medical schools, into policy schools, public health, social welfare, engineering, STEM, the whole works, right? So that's just one, right? The other is the community engagement program. We do have the largest such program in the country, Dr. Leonard Moore, and it's a great program, Division of Diversity and Community Engagement. Everybody should be pushing their school to have an annual report on what are they doing for the community, in addition to institutionally, internally facing, but externally facing. That's what we used to call the Black University in the 1960s and 70s. How are you leveraging this money for employment, for access for Black communities where the university is at? We've got a hard history in Austin, segregation, 1928 city plan, UT, no Black folks till 1950, undergraduates, 1953. The dorms weren't really racially integrated until the 1970s. We have a hard history here that we're still battling because the institution is a racist institution. And all institutions of higher ed are racist institutions, right? And so they could do a lot internally and externally. The only way they will is through pressure. Frederick Douglass, and there's the great David Blight, Pulitzer Prize winning Frederick Douglass book, biography, he said, power concedes nothing without demand, never has, never will, right? And so this idea of asking power, that's what speaking truth to power is. It's saying, we are making these demands and you have to leverage those demands, especially when you're doing it nonviolent, right? So part of it is saying, look, universities that are not gonna be making anti-racism central to who they are going to have a hard time in the new marketplace. It's sort of making that, and part of it is white allies. White allyship can really help with universities, because a lot of times they're listening, not even a lot of times, we know most of the time, white folks are listening to other white folks way before they listen to any Black person, right? There might be 1 or 2 Black people in the world they're listening to. Robert Smith, private equity, listen to Oprah, listen to Barack. And a lot of times the folks they're gonna listen to aren't necessarily the most radical folks in the room, right? So we have to really understand, and this pushes back against what, remember Jay-Z calling Kaepernick, Jay-Z, when are we gonna stop marching? My answer is, brother, never, until freedom is achieved. That's when we stop marching. So the whole thing, just because you're straight and you got $1 billion doesn't mean I'm not gonna march for me and my daughter, right? And even if we have the billion, we should still be marching until all of us are free. That's what Malcolm X said. He said, no matter how many white folks try to treat me and extend and treat me as a human being or with dignity, until that dignity is extended to every last Black woman, child. He said, not just in the United States, but on the planet Earth, it means nothing. And that's what we say. That's what we say. So the university has a long way to go. We have to agitate both politically, intellectually, but we also have to concede and let people know by speaking truth to power that to build the beloved community, like Dr. King often said, we've got to tell people that what they're doing is morally reprehensible. You've got to say it. That's what I'm saying. I'm an old Christian boy from New York City, New Bethel Baptist Church, and we talked about morality, and not a cheap morality of who was sleeping with whom. We talked about morality that counted, like Black babies dying and Black women dying in childbirth, because this country is morally reprehensible. That's the whole thing. So everybody out there who thought that their pappies and daddies and great grandfathers were in heaven, who were part of the Confederacy, they're not. If you read your Old Testament, they're doomed forever in hell for what they did. Slavery is not something that you get a pass for, right? And so we have to speak truth to power and say, this is a political problem, but it's also a moral problem. And we know what's been happening. Black people who spent their lives working on this for citizenship and dignity know these institutions are morally reprehensible. Now is the time to continue to say that and to have allies who say, we can actually transform this morally reprehensible place that mistreats Black people, that dehumanizes Black students, that doesn't care about Black lives or history, and we can actually reimagine it as something better. And white people who join us are gonna discover in the process something that they've never had, which is their own humanity. Because you can't have your own humanity sitting on George Floyd's neck or killing Sandra Bland and saying that it's suicide. That's not a human being. That's something different. That's something else. And so they can embrace, if you have a deep empathy for Black people, you can finally get that thing that you've never had in this country or even globally, which is humanity.
Thank you so much, Dr.
Thank you so much, Dr. Joseph. I could probably sit and listen to you speak forever, pretty much. But I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Chavis just for some closing remarks. If you haven't noticed, and for those of you who are on the call, we're having some weather issues, it looks like in the DC area, and the electricity for some people is going in and out. Unfortunately, it looks like we might have lost Andy, but we're trying to get him back in. So Dr. Chavis, if you have any closing thoughts, and then as we work to try to get Andy back on.
No worries. Before we close, I wanted to offer Dr. Joseph this opportunity to tell us a little bit about his latest publication. I know it's going to be equally as amazing as all of his other work, but please, Doc, tell us about The Sword and the Shield.
Oh yeah, so this is my latest book, The Sword and the Shield, The Revolutionary Lives of Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. And basically, I mean, that book deals with a lot of what we're facing right now. It's a dual biography, makes an argument that Malcolm and Martin are much more closer than we think. So it goes away from dream versus nightmare and makes an argument that Malcolm X was talking about radical Black dignity. He was Black America's prosecuting attorney. Dr. King was talking about radical Black citizenship. And over time, they come to see that we need both. When you think about radical Black dignity, Malcolm X takes Black humanity as a given. He's not trying to protest to white people about Black humanity. He's looking for radical Black political, cultural, economic self-determination. So Malcolm X is Black Power's avatar. And when we think about King, King is serving as a defense attorney. He actually defends Black lives to white people and white humanity to Black people. But he's talking about radical Black citizenship, which he defines as not just an end of racial segregation, but and voting rights, but he defines it as universal basic income, decent housing, guaranteed job, end of violence and materialism for everyone, right? And so when we think about King and Malcolm, they're hugely important for the time we live in now, both local, national, and global. They face the criminal justice system. Both of them negotiated with racist police chiefs in LA and New York to try to bend the curve on police brutality. They failed. Both of them spoke truth to power and were anti-colonial, anti-imperialist. Both of them had a critique of capitalism and racial capitalism. Both of them talked about the third world and African independence and revolution. Malcolm more so on the third world global liberation front. King drilled down in terms of anti-poverty, and both of them were against the Vietnam War. I argue that they serve as each other's alter ego. So when Dr. King becomes this radical and then a revolutionary in the late 60s, he's echoing a lot of what Malcolm X says. And that's what's so interesting. He's talking about Black America experiencing and being on the receiving end of a series of crimes that white people have done. One of the most poignant parts of the book is when King is in Marks, Mississippi, poorest zip code in America, and he's saying that what's happened to people here is a crime. It's a crime against humanity, right? That's what Malcolm had said, and Malcolm had done his own 1619 project since the 1950s, talking about racial slavery and the impact racial slavery had on Black people. House Negroes versus field Negroes was Malcolm's ultimate analogy about that, right? So when we think about Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr., my argument is that you need both of them. They're two revolutionary sides of the same coin, and by splitting them up, we haven't framed the movement in the right way. And all these movements for Black Lives Matter, all these movements for reparations, all these movements that we're seeing today are connected and building off of what Dr. King and Malcolm both agreed was a human rights movement, but it was a human rights movement in searching for universality through the particular struggle of Black people locally, nationally, and globally. So that idea of even the sword and the shield, that's the metaphor. We usually think of Malcolm as the political sword, King as the shield, and they're really both, right? Malcolm is a political sword and the shield, but so is King. The reason why King's assassinated, King becomes, after Malcolm's death, alongside of people like Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture, the biggest critic of white supremacy, defund Vietnam, end criminal injustice in the United States, feed everyone, stop war, violence, and he talked about militarism, materialism, and racism as a triple evils facing humanity. So that's Dr. King. Dr. King is a radical and then revolutionary civil and human rights leader, but so is Malcolm X. Malcolm X is a radical, revolutionary Black power leader, right? And Malcolm is talking about universalism, but he's talking about universalism in Black, which people still can't get then or now because Black people are not perceived as human beings, right? They tell us to read Shakespeare in any book that a white person has written, and we're supposed to find ourselves in there, and we do. But then when it comes to Black person and Toni Morrison and James Baldwin, right? Edwidge Danticat, the white people said they can't get it. They can't get it. This person's too Black for them to get it. Person's too queer for them to get it, right? And it's like, no. Human rights is human rights for all of us, or it means human rights for none of us, right? And so that's what the sword and the shield talks about and argues, and it really provides a history of the heroic period of the civil rights movement and the Black power movement, and also talks about how it interfaces in our own time.
Thank you again, Dr. Joseph. I mean, we're witnessing narrative change now, and I'm just so thankful for your work, your scholarship, your activism. And I'm thankful for Andy for helping us pull this all together. This is a bittersweet moment for us because this is the end of our Mondays in June series, but we will return to do more series. We're going to do 2 events in July, and then we're going to continue in August to do our weekly Monday events. But I wanted to, before I close out, just announce that on Friday, July 4th, we will be releasing our digital magazine, The Freedom's Cloud. And so we're excited about that. And Andy, I'll turn that over to you, and just be on the lookout for registration links and more information about our digital magazine, but also our newsletter. And thank you again, Dr. Joseph, and I look forward to talking with you soon.
Thank you, Dr. James. Thank you.
There's so many questions that I have, but I'm not going to do that because we're at the end of the session. But I appreciate you so much, and look forward to hopefully bringing you back if you don't mind.
Absolutely.
And bring you back not only on this, but also the Busboys and Poets.
No, I love it. I love Busboys.
Kind of normalcy. We'd love to have you back.
Yeah, thank you.
This conversation is not going away. I mean, when we opened Busboys and Poets 15 years ago, the first regular ongoing program we had, starting with the first month we opened, was a continuing talk on race. Because I, as a foreigner, someone coming from another country, an immigrant, recognize that race is the most essential thing we have to address in this country before we go move anywhere.
Yes.
And you were right about the idea of the diversity training that was happening. I was involved in some of that diversity training when I was working with the school board in Fairfax County, and the word race never came up during the entire training 2 weeks session. Race did not come up. And it turned out that diversity training was really set up to make white people comfortable.
Yes.
And that was really the purpose of it. It wasn't about changing the culture or changing anything. It was just, how can we make white people feel safe again in the workplace?
Yes.
And that was really what a purpose of it. And I'm glad to see these changes are taking shape. I'm not convinced this is the third reconstruction, as you say, but I'm with you. I'm going to stay with this and see where this goes. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you again, Dr. Joseph. We're so deeply honored for this time. I can speak for myself and several members of our team at the John Mitchell Junior program that we are fired up. We are ready to move this conversation forward. So we are very, very excited. I think we might have lost him, unfortunately. But in the meantime, we would like to thank all of you who have attended these events over the month of June. We thank you so much for being an active audience, a really engaged audience. We deeply appreciate all your questions, your comments, and that you continue to follow Busboys and Poets, that you continue to support the work that Busboys and Poets is doing, supporting their bookstore, which has many, many, many of the books that Dr. Joseph was speaking about. We want to continue to ask you to support the work of the John Mitchell program. Audrey has so kindly put links to both Busboys and Poets and the John Mitchell program in the chat, and we invite you to explore those sites and really get engaged with our program, whether you're here in the Washington, D.C. area or elsewhere in the country. And I personally would like to just thank, on behalf of the John Mitchell program, Andy, thank you so much to you, your team, all of those behind the scenes who have made these conversations possible. We are so deeply grateful for all the hard work that you've done in the community and for allowing us this space and time to engage with you. So thank you very much, Andy. We so appreciate you and all of your team. It means so much. And thank you all for spending this time with us. Again, feel free to connect with us online, and we look forward to continuing this conversation through the rest of the summer and continuously, because this is something that we cannot stop doing. As Dr. Joseph so eloquently said, we have to keep marching on. So thank you all for participating, and we look forward to next steps. Thank you guys, and have a great evening.